Hi everyone! Today I'm going to show you how to sketch and draw a simple flower arrangement. As spring gets a little bit closer, I always start thinking about flowers this time of year. I have the urge to start planting things in the garden, and I also have the urge to paint flowers as well. I got these flowers at my local grocery store, but feel free to try it with flowers you can find in your own backyard. I already have some watercolor paper mounted with masking tape on a hard surface. Today I'm using a clipboard for that. I have my water, my brushes, and my paint ready to go. If you've watched my previous videos, you know that I usually start off with a simple sketch before I pick up the paint. I start with a sketch because it helps me plan out my composition before I pick up the paint. It's much easier to erase pencil than it is to try to lift up watercolor paint after it's on the paper. I'm starting off with the outline of the vase, a hint of where the water is supposed to go, and the only real background I'm going to do is that one little horizon line that indicates my windowsill. Again, this is a very rough, simple drawing, so I'm not even putting in the individual flower petals or all of the leaves. I'm sketching where the tulip heads are and what direction they're pointing, but I'm not putting in any other details. So this right here, this is the drawing that we're going to be working with today. If you want to try doing a painting of your own, try to think about what really needs to be there in the drawing and what you can leave up to the paint. You don't have to draw as much as you think you do. You'll notice that I've slowed down the footage to real time so you can see how I'm starting to map in the glass for this vase. This is a clear glass vase that I'm painting. And if you've ever looked at clear glass, you notice that there are a lot of highlights where the light is hitting it. Clear glass also picks up some of the colors and shapes behind it, or that are reflecting off of the glass. It sounds more complicated to paint than it actually is. It just takes a little bit of practice. You can see that I've left a couple white areas where the highlights are, and I'm filling in some of the darker areas with a little bit more paint. Because we're dealing with a clear glass vase, some of the tulip stems are showing through, and that's what I'm adding right now with the green. I'm using a nice yellow spring green that matches my tulip stems. And now I'm going to start sketching in where my tulip stems and tulip leaves are going to go. Since this is a very small little watercolor, I'm not trying to cram in every single detail. And at the moment, I'm only using one green, this yellow green. Later on, I'm going to come back with some darker greens and start blending it in. Now I'm adding some of the colors for my tulips. I am working with red and yellow tulips today. And again, I'm making very rough, loose strokes with my brush. I'm just trying to get my shapes on the paper before I worry about anything else. You can see here that I'm going back with a darker green on top of the yellow spring green, and this is just to add some of the shadows in the stems that I see in front of me. I'm going to do the same thing for the leaves now. At the moment, I'm painting wet over dry, which means the paint layer underneath has totally dried, and I'm adding wet paint on top of it. I'm going to go back with a little water on my brush to soften some of these edges in just a minute. There is another watercolor technique called painting wet into wet, which is where you add wet paint into an area that is still wet, and that lets the colors bleed together a little bit more. As you work with watercolor, you'll figure out what areas you want to paint wet over dry and what areas you want a little bit more of that runny, soft watercolor look when you paint wet into wet. Alright, let me slow down the footage once more so I can show you how I'm going in now and very carefully starting to add a few extra little tulip stems. One nice thing about doing small studies like this is it helps you simplify your shapes. If you're like me and you tend to get caught up in the details and the small, complicated parts of what you're trying to paint, sometimes it helps to sort of shrink something down really small and really look at what are the most important shapes and the most important colors. What details can I leave out? What details still need to be in the painting for it to make sense? As you get more accustomed to working and painting and creating on your own, you'll get more of a feel for what can you leave out, what do you want to keep in. You can see that I'm leaving some areas of the glass white or unpainted, as I mentioned before, and that's to help simulate the appearance of reflections. The clear vase is also casting a very interesting shadow on my windowsill because the light's coming through it and it's sort of acting a little bit like a prism. So I'm just adding a little bit of paint to suggest that shadow. I'm not going to do much more of a background than that because that's not the purpose of what I'm painting today. I'm adding just a little bit more color in the tulips just to give them that hint of vibrance toward the center or the base of the tulip. If you look at flowers, you'll notice that there's usually a little bit more of a fading effect towards the edge of the petals, and then as you move towards the center of the flowers, they're usually a little more vibrant. That's not always the case, but it's just kind of a general rule of thumb. I'm just putting a few last touches on these tulips, mixing a little bit of green in there to suggest the stamens. And that is all for this little study today. I hope you have a chance to try this on your own and celebrate the arrival of spring. Thank you for watching.